This episode is the century mark in our church history series. It marks the end of this series because, well, in a little over a month, I'm going to be a content provider for Enduring Word. That's the ministry of my friend David Guzik, who has an online Bible commentary that gets about 15 million hits a month. It's an amazing work. I encourage you to head on over and check out enduringword.com. I'm going to be starting over this series on church history, a bit more in-depth. I'm going to lengthen each episode from the current 20-ish minutes to 30 minutes. We're going to slow down the pace a bit to go just a little bit deeper. And added to this series will be the development of Christian theology along the way. Now, we're not going to go into much depth in that regard. We're not going to get into the weeds of the evolution of theology, but we will connect the main ideas and doctrines of the Christian faith to those moments in church history where they were developed. Now, when that series launches, I will post a video here on the Into His Image YouTube channel on where you can go to find it, whether we do it here on Into His Image or over on the enduringword.com site. Now, before we dive into this last episode, I want to say thanks to subscribers. I'm going to continue to post content here on Into His Image. Post regular content on the series, Musings of a SoCal Pastor, as well as biblical worldview stuff. And if you want to be notified when new content posts, be sure to tick the bell icon in the subscribe box. All right, here we go. The last episode of this iteration of Communio Sanctorum, History of the Christian Church. In our review of the Reformation, we began with a look at its roots and the long call for reform that had been heard in the Roman Church. Those roots led to the budding of the Reformation in Germany with Martin Luther and Philip Melanchthon. At the same time, the reformer Ulrich Zwingli was at work in Zurich, Switzerland. Later, in Geneva, the Frenchman John Calvin added his input. John Knox carried it to his native Scotland, while Thomas Cranmer led it in England. We've taken a look at the Roman Catholic response in what's called the Counter-Reformation, but probably ought to be labeled as the Catholic Reformation. We briefly considered the Council of Trent, where the Roman Church retrenched in its perspective on the issues that had been raised by the Protestants. A clear line was drawn, marking the difference in doctrine between the two groups. We saw the Jesuits, the learned shock troops of the Roman Church, sent out both on mission and to counter the impact of the Reformation in the regions of Europe that were being swung toward the Protestant camp. We go a little further now with the Catholic Counter-Reformation, well, because Europe is about to plunge into several decades of war over the differing religious affiliations of its various kingdoms. There were at least 4 ingredients in the Counter-Reformation. The first concerned the older religious orders of the Catholic Church. There was a spiritual renewal within the older orders, that is, the Franciscans and the Dominicans, including the Benedictines. Reform among the Franciscans led to the founding of the Capuchins in 1528. Their energetic work among the Italian peasantry kept them loyal to Rome. Second, new orders sprang up, groups like the Theatines, who called both clergy and laity to a more godly lifestyle. The Ursulines were an order of women who cared for the sick and the poor. And then, of course, there were the Jesuits, who we've already looked at. The Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, were the most important of the new orders. Founded in Paris in 1534 by Ignatius of Loyola, the order required total obedience of its members for the furtherance of the interests of the Roman Church. While there were good and godly Jesuits, men who worked tirelessly to expand the kingdom of God, there were also some whose motives were, well, less noble. Okay, let's be frank. They were diabolical, utterly unscrupulous in their methods. They believed that it was permissible to do evil if good came of it. They resurrected the Inquisition in the 16th century, making it an effective tool in stomping out the Reformation in Italy, Spain, Portugal, and Belgium. Jesuits infiltrated government offices and used every means, fair or foul, to advance Rome's influence. Now, lest Catholic listeners take offense to this, understand that their power became so great and their methods so immoral, the Pope suppressed the order from 1773 to 1814. Now, also, it should be noted that when Ignatius launched the Society of Jesus, a counterattack on the Reformation was not really in his view. His ambition was missionary, with a keen desire to convert Muslims. The 3 major goals of the Jesuits were to convert pagans, combat heresy, and promote education. It was their solemn oath to obey the Pope that led to their being used as a tool of the Counter-Reformation. A third aspect of the Counter-Reformation was the Council of Trent. The cardinals elected a Dutch theologian as a reform pope in 1522, and he admitted that the problems Rome had with the Lutherans came, well, because of the corruption of the church, from the papal office on down. As we saw a couple of episodes ago, in 1536, Pope Paul III appointed a special panel of cardinals to prepare a report on the condition of the church. That report gave Luther much ammunition for his critique of Rome. It conceded that Protestantism resulted from the ambition, avarice, and cupidity of Catholic bishops. The Roman Church realized that it needed to address the issues raised by the Reformers. The Council of Trent was their answer. It met in 3 main sessions under the terms of three different popes from 1545 to 63. Participants came from Italy, Spain, France, Germany. The council decided on a wide array of issues. In direct response to Lutheran challenges, the council abolished indulgent cellars, defined obligations of the clergy, regulated the use of relics, and ordered the restructuring of bishops. The doctrinal work of Trent is summarized in the Tridentine Profession of Faith, which championed Roman Catholic dogma and provided a theological response to the Protestants. Trent rejected justification by faith alone and promoted the necessity of meritorious works as, well, necessary for salvation. It validated the 7 sacraments as bestowing merit on believers and their necessity for salvation. It affirmed the value of tradition as a basis of authority alongside the Bible. It approved the canonicity of the apocryphal books of the Old Testament, made official the existence of purgatory, the value of venerating images and relics, the efficacy of indulgences, invoking the intercession of saints as mediators with God, and the necessity of confession to a priest. It also detailed more clearly than before the beneficial aspects of the sacrifice of the Mass, and codified the previous century's rule that only the bread should be distributed to the laity. Now, the upshot of the Tridentine statement was that reconciliation with Protestants was impossible. The council's work constituted a statement of faith by which Roman Catholics could and should determine their orthodoxy. No such comprehensive statement had existed before, and if it had, perhaps the force of the Reformation would have been blunted in some places. What the Council of Trent did, in effect, was to make official dogmas of the Church that the various positions Luther had challenged in his break with Rome. A fourth aspect of the Counter-Reformation was a new and vigorous kind of spirituality that bloomed in a remarkable series of writings and movements. A few of these devotional writings, such as The Imitation of Christ by Thomas à Kempis and the Spiritual Exercises by Loyola that we've already covered, have received the attention that's due them. Well, others have not. This new kind of devout life was characterized by a systemic examination of conscience, prayer, contemplation, and spiritual direction. Its roots lay in the Middle Ages with groups like the Carthusians, who put great emphasis on the contemplative life. It was these works that fueled the calls for reform in the Roman Church before Luther even arrived on the scene. They were the reading material of groups like the Brethren of the Common Life and the Oratory of Divine Love, which provided many of the best church leaders in the years leading up to the 16th century. But, and now we get to the center of this episode, the Reformation sparked a series of religious wars across Europe. The last and most devastating of these was the 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648. As we saw in a previous episode, the Peace of Augsburg in 1555 put Lutheranism on a legal basis with Roman Catholicism in Germany. The treaty ruled that the prince of a region determined the religion in his territory. Bucking the long trend of feudalism, dissenters were then allowed to immigrate to the territory of a prince whose religion aligned with their preference. That seems obvious to the highly modern mobiles like you and I, but it wasn't for the people at that time. Due to feudal rules, people weren't allowed to move without the consent of their ruler. The Peace of Augsburg made a significant change in commoners' mobility. To preserve Catholic domination of southern Germany, the agreement mandated that Catholic rulers who became Lutherans had to surrender their rule. The agreement left out Calvinists, Anabaptists, and other Protestants. So for many, Augsburg really solved nothing. Beginning in Bohemia, the 30 Years' War ravaged Central Europe and Germany and involved all the major European powers. The Peace of Westphalia, which ended the war in 1648, resulted from long and complicated negotiations. France and Sweden gained large amounts of territory, and German princes gained greater power and influence at the expense of the Holy Roman Emperor. The treaty finally recognized Calvinism, alongside Lutheranism and Catholicism, as legal religions and permitted each ruler to determine the religion of his state, his region, his county, if you will. But take note that these three were the only legally recognized and tolerated churches. There was no room for the non-denominational churches and groups that we know today. The effects of the war were devastating for Christianity as a whole. Religious issues were increasingly treated with indifference by political leaders. Secular, self-serving matters were now the chief concern of the growing uber-worldly nation-states. The barbarity and brutality of the war left many questioning the Christian message. How could a faith that produced such atrocities be true? Doctrine took a back seat to doubt. Faith was met with skepticism. All this coming at the dawn of, and no doubt hastening, the Age of Reason. In reply to those who criticized Christianity for the wars fought at that time, it should be recognized that in every case, political, economic, and social considerations were as important as the religious, if not more so. Much of the time, there was no real struggle between Roman Catholics and Protestants. And on some fronts of the war, both Catholics and Protestants fought alongside each other as comrades because their conflict was political rather than religious. This period of European history is called the Wars of Religion, but in truth, it was rarely religion that sparked or drove the conflict. It was political and economic, hiding behind a mask of religion because that tends to stir people actually doing the fighting better than some prince wanting more land or exclusivity in a commodity or a trade route. 99 times out of 100, if you want to know the real cause of something, follow the money. Well, we turn now to the impact of the Reformation on France, and one example of how tragic things can turn, ostensibly because of religion, but really because of politics. As the 16th century wore on, the Roman Church in France fell into a progressively deplorable condition. The Concordat of Bologna in 1516 gave King Francis I the right to appoint the 10 archbishops, 38 bishops, and 527 heads of religious houses in France. That meant the church became part of a vast patronage system, and individuals won positions in the church not for their ability, their religious zeal, but for service to the crown. Simony and bribery were de rigueur. Conditions were seriously bad. Literacy among priests dropped to a mere 10%. And since the king was the head of the French church and he depended on its patronage system for income, we see why Francis I and Henry II were so zealous in their persecution of French Protestants. They couldn't afford to permit the system to crumble. They certainly weren't zealous for Catholicism, except as a tool to achieve their political ambitions. The French Protestant movement was stoked by what was happening in Geneva in Switzerland under Farel and Calvin. The French Bible, Calvin's Institutes, and numerous other Protestant publications fueled the movement. So naturally, the most literate element of the population was won over. Converts were numerous at the universities and among lawyers and other professionals. The merchant class, artisans, lower clergy, friars, and the lesser nobility. The illiterate peasantry was hardly touched and remained firmly Catholic. Politics and economics played into the mix. The middle class and lower nobility of France, they were tired of King Francis's imperial ambitions, funded on their backs. They were urged into the Protestant cause out of a desire to get rid of the king. It's estimated that 2/5 of all nobles joined the French Protestant cause. Few of them were authentically converted, but sought to use the Protestant movement to weaken the trend towards King Francis's oppressive version of royal absolutism. In spite of persecution, Protestants increased rapidly. At the beginning of the reign of Henry II in 1547, they numbered over 400,000. By the end of his reign in 1561, they were known as the Huguenots and numbered 2 million, 10% of the population. A Presbyterian system of church government gave organization, discipline to the Huguenot movement. In order to understand the course of events that the French Reformation took and see why it became embroiled in civil war, it's necessary to look at the political and social conditions of the times. First, That many of the younger nobility joined Protestant ranks is of great significance. Accustomed to carrying swords, they became protectors of Huguenot congregations during troubled times. They often protected church meetings against hostile bands of Catholic ruffians that would just wander the streets and break into church services. Second, and this is the key, there were four major groups of the nobility that were vying for the rule of France. The ruling house with the tenuous grip on the throne were the Valois. The Bourbons of Western France were the next in line should the Valois falter. Their leadership was decidedly Huguenot. The powerful Guises were equally committed Roman Catholics with extensive holdings in the East. The Montmorencys controlled the center of France. Their leadership was pretty evenly divided between Huguenots and Catholics. Now, third, when Henry II died, he left three sons, all dominated by his queen, Catherine de' Medici. She was determined to maintain personal control and advance the power of her government. She was opposed by many of the nobility, jealous of their rights, and wanted to restrict the power of the monarchy. Fourth, as the likelihood of civil war in France percolated, the English and the Spanish sent aid to their factions to serve their respective interests. Such animosities provided the tinder to ignite armed conflict. 8 wars were fought between Roman Catholics and Protestants in France. Leading the Protestants early in the conflict was Gaspard de Coligny. He was killed along with 15,000 to 20,000 Huguenots in the massacre of St. Bartholomew's Day in August of 1572. Now, after that, Henry of Navarre of the Bourbon family led the Protestants. His maneuvers were successful, and eventually, with the death of others in the royal line, he became heir to the French throne. Because he didn't have enough strength to complete his conquest, he converted to Catholicism and won the crown as Henry IV. And judging from his conduct, Henry's religious principles sat his shoulders rather lightly. His switch to the Roman Church was for purely political reasons. Most likely, he simply sought to turn off the bloodbath that was drenching France at that time. In 1598, Henry published the Edict of Nantes, a grant of toleration for the Huguenots. It guaranteed them the right to hold public office, freedom of worship in most areas of France, the privilege of educating their children in other than Roman Catholic schools, and free access to universities and hospitals. The edict was the first significant recognition of the rights of a religious minority in an otherwise intolerant age. Though the Huguenots enjoyed a period of great prosperity after that, King Louis XIV revoked the edict in 1685. Thousands of French Protestants were driven into exile, may I say to the benefit of England, Holland, Prussia, and America, where they fled for refuge. Well, that concludes our 100th episode of Communio Sanctorum History of the Christian Church, at least this iteration of it here on the Into His Image YouTube channel. I'm going to be starting over again with a more in-depth series on church history, bringing in a little bit more theology, the origin of different doctrines that have developed in the church over time to come to define Orthodox Christianity. And as I mentioned, I will be posting an episode here on the Into His Image channel so that you can see where to go for that.